Shannon Simone. Hello, my name is Shannon Simone, and today we'll be talking about the feedback loops in the non-gravid female reproductive system. Before we get started, I'm going to do a quick review of the female reproductive system. We will be focusing on the ovaries and the uterus. The ovaries is the site of follicular mature, where follicles mature from the primordial or primary follicle all the way to the oocyte. The oocyte will then get released into the fallopian tube, where it gets fertilized by a sperm. Either way, if it gets fertilized or not, it then travels down to the uterus, where it becomes implanted in the uterine wall. If it does not get implanted, it just exits through the vagina. The uterine wall, the uterus also goes through its own cycle, where it proliferates and prepares for pregnancy. If the female becomes pregnant, it then goes through a secretory phase, and if she does not get pregnant, then the uterus then sloughs and goes into the menses phase. The menstrual cycle is a monthly cyclic pattern of the woman's reproductive system, which lasts roughly about 28 days. It includes an ovarian cycle and a uterine cycle. The cycle starts with the shedding of the uterus, called menses, while overlapping with the ovarian follicular phase, which generally lasts from 1 to 14 days but can last up to 21 days. The ovarian follicular phase is the start of multiple follicles maturing and moves to the latter part of the phase, which includes only one follicle completing maturity. After the uterus sheds, it begins proliferating again. This occurs at the later part of the ovarian follicular phase. Once an ovum has reached maturity, it bursts from its follicle and is released into the fallopian tubes. This is ovulation. After ovulation, the ovarian cycle enters the luteal phase, where the ruptured follicle becomes a corpus luteum and begins secreting hormones in preparation for pregnancy. Or, if pregnancy does not occur, after about 2 weeks, the corpus luteum ceases function and the ovarian cycle begins again. During the luteal phase, the uterus enters its secretory phase, which prepares the uterus for pregnancy. If pregnancy does not occur, it will then shed, entering the menses phase again. Now we will dive into the hormonal control of the menstrual cycle, which is primarily under the control of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, also known as GnRH, which is secreted from the hypothalamus, the FSH, follicular stimulating hormone, and LH, luteal hormone, which are secreted from the anterior pituitary, and then estrogen, progesterone, inhibin, and AMH, which is secreted from the ovary. Here in the early follicular phase, the dominant hormone in control is estrogen. GnRH is released from the hypothalamus, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH, which stimulates maturing of the follicles. The granulosa cells from the follicles under the influence of FSH and the thecal cells surrounding the follicles under the influence of LH produce estrogen. Granulosa cells also secrete AMH, anti-Müllerian hormone, which decreases the sensitivity of the follicles to FSH, preventing recruitment of additional primary follicles. Thecal cells also synthesize androgens that diffuse into neighboring granulosa cells, where aromatase converts them into estrogens. This increasing level of estrogen in the circulation has a negative feedback on the pituitary for FSH, LH, and GnRH secretion, preventing development of additional follicles in the same cycle. Estrogen also stimulates additional estrogen production on the granulosa cells, even though FSH and LH decreases. As follicles enlarge, granulosa cells secrete fluid from which collects in the central cavity known as the antrum. Antral fluid contains hormones and enzymes for ovulation. Atresia, which is hormone-regulated cell death, occurs at each stage of the follicular development, so only one dominant follicle develops until ovulation. Menstruation ends during early follicular phase. Under influence of estrogen from developing follicles, the endometrium grows and proliferates. Estrogen also causes mucus glands of the cervix to produce clear, watery fluid, or mucus. Here in the late follicular phase, ovarian estrogen secretion peaks and a single maturing follicle now secretes inhibin and progesterone in addition to estrogen. Estrogen was a negative feedback in the early phase, now has a positive feedback on the GnRH, leading to a pre-ovulatory GnRH surge. Persistent high levels of estrogen and progesterone creates a increased sensitivity of the anterior pituitary response to the GnRH, which creates an LH and an FSH surge. However, we do not see the FSH surge because of the negative feedback of inhibin on FSH. However, without the LH surge, we would not see the final steps of ovulation take place. Now, the primary oocyte is converted into a secondary oocyte in a polar body, which we do not see here. The polar body gets excreted. Antral fluid collects and grows the follicle to its greatest size. High levels of estrogen in the late follicular phase prepares the uterus for pregnancy, and cervical glands produce copious amounts of thin, stringy mucus to facilitate sperm entry. About 16 to 24 hours after this LH peaks, ovulation occurs, and a mature follicle secretes cholinase, which dissolves the collagen holding the follicular cells together, and an inflammatory reaction occurs. This attracts leukocytes, which secrete prostaglandin into the follicle, causing smooth muscle cells in the outer theca to contract and rupture the follicle wall, which you see here. Antral fluid spurts out along with the egg, surrounded by 2 to 3 layers of granulosa cells, and the egg is swept into the fallopian tube. Additionally, LH surge causes follicular thecal cells to migrate into the antral space and mix with the former granulosa cells, transforming into luteal cells of the corpus luteum. This is called luteinization. Newly formed luteal cells accumulate lipid droplets and glycogen granules in their cytoplasm and begin to secrete progesterone and estrogen, while estrogen diminishes. Now in the luteal phase, progesterone is the dominant hormone. After ovulation, the corpus luteum, which was left over after the egg was had burst out of the ovary, we're left with the corpus luteum, which increases progesterone and estrogen. The combination of estrogen and progesterone has a negative feedback on the anterior in the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. The secretion of FSH and LH is further suppressed by this inhibin, which is secreted from the corpus luteum, so that throughout most of the luteal phase, there is no GnRH, no FSH, and no LH during this phase. Under the influence of progesterone from the corpus luteum, the endometrium continues preparation for pregnancy and enters its secretory phase of the uterine cycle. Now we enter the late luteal phase, where the corpus luteum, which has a lifespan of about 12 days, lasts. If pregnancy does not occur, the corpus luteum spontaneously undergoes apoptosis to become inactive. This is when it turns into corpus albicans, which is when it turns kind of a white-looking color. As the luteal cells degenerate and progesterone and estrogen production decreases, it removes the negative feedback signal on the pituitary and the hypothalamus, and the secretion of FSH and the LH increases. We are here. Maintenance of the secretory endometrium depends on the presence of progesterone. When the corpus luteum degenerates and the hormone production decreases, blood vessels in the surface layer of the endometrium contract. The endometrium now begins to slough its layer and enters the menses cycle again. This completes the menstrual cycle. In review, the menstrual cycle is primarily under the control of the hormones GnRH, FSH, LH, in addition to estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin and AMH, which all come from the ovary. In the follicular phase, where estrogen is the dominant hormone, FSH and LH were secreted to start the development of the follicle. This is when the estrogen secretion begins, which then creates a negative feedback to prevent further follicles from maturing. As the dominant follicle matures, we enter the ovulation phase where estrogen has a positive feedback to allow for LH surge. This is when ovulation occurs. Finally, after ovulation, we enter the luteal phase, where the hormone under dominant control is the progesterone secreted from the leftover corpus luteum in the ovary. In non-gravid women, the corpus luteum will then, after about 12 days, go through apoptosis. Progesterone levels will then fall, causing the endometrium to go through menses. The decrease in the progesterone removes the negative feedback and allows for the GnRH secretion to happen, starting the cycle over. Thank you for listening to this presentation. All of the information and images were obtained from the Human Physiology and Integrated Approach by Silverthorne, DU et al. Thank you.